Okay, hello everyone and welcome to Concordia University's fourth space, and thank you for joining us for today's event. Convergences, the 2024 Literature Undergrads Colloquium here at Concordia. Now to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube, and we are live from fourth space, and we are located at unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to mobilize knowledge, co-create daily activities, examine research questions, look at projects that are in development across the university. And today we're running this event as a live-streamed Zoom meeting also, so we welcome comments and questions there via the chat. Those of you in the space during the Q&A, etc., if you'd like to participate, just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone over to you so that everyone can hear. With that, it's very much my pleasure to hand it over to the co-editor-in-chief of the magazine and the co-organizer of this event, Louise Van Oel. Louise, welcome.
Thank you very much. So thanks everyone for coming. So welcome to the 10th edition of LUCC, the Literature Undergraduates Colloquium at Concordia. Our theme this year is Convergences, Literature Crossing Disciplines. So over the course of the day, we'll be exploring papers in which literature intersects with other disciplines, and we're going to find out exactly how fruitful interdisciplinary dialogue can be. So thank you very much to Fourth Space for hosting us and for your year-round support of conversations between disciplines and faculties at the university. And our first panel of the day will be individuals in community, and we'll be looking forward to hearing from students Hannah, Ben, and Darcy, who will be introduced by community organizer and PhD candidate Michelle Duchesneau. And just to give you a quick rundown of how the rest of the day will go in case you're around campus and would like to come back by. Our second panel will be Reframing the Past, starting at 1 p.m., and our history department professor, Dr. Shannon McSheffrey, will be introducing three student speakers, Cassandra, Teomi, and Maya. And we'll have a social from 2:30 to 3 p.m. with food, 2 to 2:30 p.m., and there will be food and coffee, and so feel free to come by for that as well. And to close our day, the panel Our Spatial Realities will feature students Jess, Emily, and Morgan, who will be introduced by Cameron Brubacher, Honors Undergraduate Student in Urban Planning. So lastly, we'll close with another social from 5 to 6 p.m., which you're also all welcome to attend. And we hope you will come by to celebrate the close of a day of interdisciplinary conversation with us. And lastly, it's my great pleasure to introduce and cede the floor to our chair of the English department, Professor Stephen Yeager. Thank you for coming. Enjoy your day.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you also, Emily, for planning the event, organizing the conference. I'm just going to go ahead and we'll give them a quick hand for their wonderful work on this. There's a lot of talk at Concordia these days about experiential learning, which is to say a mode of learning that models the material environments of practice and especially a professional practice. And in my view, LUCC, which I've always pronounced like, I'm your father and not luck, like of the draw. Maybe I'm wrong, but LUCC, however we pronounce it, it exemplifies the best of what experiential learning can be, in my view. Insofar as it's an opportunity for the writing and study of literature to come out of the classroom and into the sort of environment where it lives in the wild. When a professional researcher's ideas about a text have reached their final form, they're typically written up in an article or a book chapter that gets sent out into the world to endure as long as the proprietary format of the PDF continues to endure. But before it reaches that point, when it's still fresh and they're still thinking it over, then they present it at a conference like this one. And where it can take years from that final form of the article to actually make it out into the world for people to read it. What's wonderful about conferences, in my view, is actually the fact that sometimes those presentations don't really get finalized until the plane on the way to the conference, or sometimes even in the hotel room right before. This is something that academics make fun of themselves for, but I like it that when people go into the room, they're presenting the freshest, most of the moment, take that they have on the idea that they're thinking through. And so while the essays we're about to hear are going to be a bit more polished than the papers that the professional researchers would typically deliver, my hope is that the discussion today will have that looseness and generosity and of the momentness that characterizes the best conference panels, where presenters are eager to hear new perspectives on their fresh ideas, that what's exciting them at the moment. And audience members are also excited to engage with those ideas and to sort of talk them through in a way which is sort of beyond the classroom with its, I have to produce this for 15% of my grade, but simply about, following the idea through to where it leads you. And so in the spirit of making this year's LUCC an ideal experience of learning along these lines, then I'm just going to summarize briefly for everyone my understanding of the practices for both presenters and audience members that I think are most important to keep in mind as we participate in these events. For presenters, you guys have it easiest. Actually, the only rule for you is to not go over your time. I know that it seems strange that that's the most important thing, but it really is. Just say your thing and as much as you can in the time that you have, and then you can always save the rest for the questions period. But for the audience, I encourage you all to listen carefully to every paper and to keep notes as you listen about what your question about that paper might be. Not necessarily that you're going to ask it, but just it's a good way and a good practice of engaging with the paper, even when it's on a topic you know nothing about or don't necessarily see the connection to. Just kind of imagine, if you were to enter into conversation with the speaker, what would the first question that you'd ask? What is the specific aspect of that paper you try to clarify? How is that thing you try to clarify essential to what the speaker seems to be thinking about? Not just, the stating your own opinion or the comment that's more of a question, but even if it is just a comment, what is that thing that out of that paper that you connect to? One way of thinking about a question is as a gift that you give to the presenter, as a sort of thank you for taking the time to get up there and share with you their thoughts, which is a welcome one from the presenter who, again, in these professional contexts is looking for that engagement, for that spark of conversation. The true function of these events is not just for us to share the work that we've done, but to start those conversations. And I'm looking forward very much to the conversations that we have today. That's enough from me. Thank you all so much for coming to this event. Thank you again to the organizers for setting it up. Thanks to those of you at home for watching it. And let's get started.
I'm just going to step in quickly and introduce our first special guest speaker, who's been good enough to join us today to introduce and help moderate our first panel. Michelle Duchesneau, I think, is a perfect fit for this panel, which is all about the individual and community, because I actually know her through my community, where she's, an important person who makes a lot of stuff happen. Michelle is very involved with the Co-op Bâtiment 7 in Pointe St. Charles, and is a community organizer who's working with a youth group there called Press Start. Very interesting work. I'm not going to do a whole humongous spiel about it, but obviously a person who cares a lot about work in the community and what it can achieve. At the same time, Michelle is also a PhD candidate here at Concordia, studying in an individualized program. I think she's in a better position to explain sort of the specifics of her studies, but when we discussed it, it seemed like a lot of the things that she's interested in her academic career really touch on themes that we're gonna see in this first panel. So everything from the individual's development in a group to what work can mean for an individual when their work is motivated by a sense of community, all kinds of interesting things that her studies focus on. So welcome, Michelle.
Hello. I'm super nervous. So maybe I'll give a little blurb about myself, and then I'll introduce the folks and their lovely papers. So I've worked for over 20 years as a community organizer in Point St. Charles, particularly working with youth in the development of alternative projects, so alternative sexual health projects, alternative economic practices. And my research at Concordia in the special individualized program is looking at the transformational potential of youth-led emancipatory economic practices. So I think it was so interesting to read these three papers and engage in the subject of self and community. Really so nervous. So the first paper is by Hannah Lowe, Jobs Worth Doing, Labor, Self, and Community in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. So many notes. Ben Stone's Poetic Potentiality, Crisis of Connection in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And Darcy Deegan, Navigating the Invisible, The Map of Shame and Development in Milkman. So those are the three folks who will be discussing their papers. And I guess I have to give a little intro blurb. So I think that, as I named, a lot of my work is actually in creating alternatives to capitalism and working from an anti-racist, decolonial framework. And so it was really interesting to engage, I think in particular with the first one on jobs worth doing, and thinking about labor in the context of the work that I do, and how it can connect individuals to community. I think in the paper, it positions labor and rest as two separate things, and the economic framework that I work from challenges, one, our notion of labor or work, and thinking through it in this more complex way and as a way to build community and connect folks. But within that framework, rest is essential. And I think that in the capital-centric kind of context that we exist in, I think often work and rest are pitted against each other. And in a Judeo-Christian society that values values work and the individual in pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, and I think is very different from my work. And I think that the way that this essay engages with labor, but at the same time engages with this notion of rest cure, which is interesting. And so it for me separates labor and rest as two separate things versus as two things that are needed in communities and in self, in the self in community. And so I think I have questions around that division afterwards. And so the work I do actually is engaging youth in community and the development of self in the collective. So youth are kind of transformed in this process of challenging capital-centric visions of the world and the individual, and are engaged in consensus decision-making. And so there's an important element in that. And in the projects that I run, I think that rest is a bit different in that it's not, that youth need to take themselves out to rest and to care for themselves, but that we engage young folks in kind of collective care and rest and being together. And so there's something in challenging capitalism that's about challenging these notions of work and rest as separate, and that they are that we can co-construct community and work together with these two elements. The poetic potentiality, crisis of connection. I think that this essay was really interesting. I think that in one of the elements that we talk about at Press Start is environmental justice work and this notion of connection and disconnection. And I think that there's this moment of crisis of hopelessness that that exists in lots of young people in the communities that I work with. And sorry, feeling very nervous. And so I think that, you know, there's this idea that you know, the culture shifts that are happening, I think that the deconstruction of like the hegemonic kind of Western-centric notions are emerging more and more, and I think that you know, when thinking of the individual in community in the context of like a crisis of connection, I think what I'm seeing in my research and in the communities that I work in is that there's not one notion of community, but many communities, and that the connection is emerging in different ways. And I think I love T.S. Eliot's work, and I think that the form of poetry feels very much in connection to what we're kind of experiencing in this moment. Navigating the invisible, the map of shame and development. Thank you for your patience. Well, I think the element of shame is something that's emerged a lot in my work around sexual health and youth, and in shaping how folks develop in the context of community. I'm going somewhere. And so I think it's interesting that it's you know, it's talking about shame, which are, you know, the cultural norms and societal norms that exist in community. And in this essay, I think I think the character that Darcy engages with, you know, attempts to kind of work outside of community and challenges these cultural norms. So when I was touching on Ben's essay, I was talking about this notion of communities versus community. And I think that in the alternative economic initiatives and the community initiatives that I work in, I think that you can see how shame shapes young folks, but how they're also challenging these notions in different ways and building communities that challenge those notions of shame and reconstruct other identities that work outside of that. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Hannah, and I'm going first. My paper is called Jobs Worth Doing, Labor, Self, and Community in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Virginia Woolf's 1925 novel, Mrs. Dalloway, embodies quintessential features of modernist literature. Fragmented narratives, time jumps, stream of conscious writing, individualism, and cityscapes are all present in Woolf's winding story that shifts between perspectives and psyches as effortlessly as breathing. In addition, Woolf's novel is concerned with modernist attitudes towards labor and the role it plays in the development of a self, and specifically the implications for those who do not labor. Morag Shiach summarizes the work of several late 19th and early 20th century philosophical thinkers who considered the effect of labor on individuals. Shiach compiles the thoughts of these philosophers to come to the conclusion that in the early 20th century, labor is understood as the energy of will, as the process of growth and creativity that drives both the individual and the human species. While I do not suggest that Mrs. Dalloway directly supports a specific philosopher's views on labor, I do analyze aspects of the novel in conjunction with this concept that labor drives the individual by allowing for creativity and growth. Paying close attention to Clarissa Dalloway and Septimus Smith and the effect that manual labor has on them, I will demonstrate that Mrs. Dalloway, in keeping with some strands of modernist political thought, suggests that labor, especially manual labor, plays a crucial role in a person's sense of self and their ability to function and feel valuable in the modern world. Shiach's broad examination of different political thinkers singles out John Ruskin and his disciple William Morris as critical contributors to modernist considerations of labor and selfhood. Crucially, Ruskin wrote that work is indeed at once a luxury and a necessity. No man can retain either health of mind or body without it. Morris's political ideas contradict and twist over the years, but some of the main tenets of his thinking were that people are meant to labor, labor should be useful, and there ought to be pleasure involved in labor and its outcomes. William Casement helpfully summarizes some of Morris's ideas, saying, beyond the feelings of self-worth and harmony accompanying an individual's awareness of his cooperative role in production is the honor which accrues to the laborer. Not only will an individual recognize the use in what he produces, but will be rewarded by honor. To distill Morris's thoughts, then, labor allows a person to experience self-worth and to gain a sense of honor because the labor they are doing is valuable to a larger body of people. They are able to work harmoniously to benefit a collective, which enables them to feel proud of their work and value themselves. Through the application of labor to a greater purpose, an individual is able to claim self-worth and define their place in the world. As I mentioned, I do not claim that Woolf was writing with a particular theory of labor in mind, but it is worth noting that Woolf briefly mentions Morris in Mrs. Dalloway. In the golden days of Clarissa's youth, Sally Seton secretly gives her one of Morris's politically charged books, and the two young women pore over it, absorbing Morris's politics and making plans to change the world. Turning now to consider the characters in Mrs. Dalloway. Miss Kilman thinks of Clarissa as a woman who did nothing and believed nothing. Compared to the work that Miss Kilman must do in order to support herself, Clarissa's life seems easy and unburdened by the necessity of labor. But this lack of work in Clarissa's life is actually a problem that Clarissa seems to be at least subconsciously aware of. The novel does not begin with Clarissa doing nothing, but rather opens with a very deliberate insistence that Clarissa is doing something. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, for Lucy had her work cut out for her. Clarissa is out walking, enjoying the streets of London and executing a task, the purchasing of flowers, that needs to be completed. Not long after, Clarissa is back at home, where she embarks upon another task, mending the green silk dress that she plans on wearing at her party that evening. While it is perhaps a stretch to argue that buying flowers is an act of labor, sewing falls more firmly into the category of domestic work. Clarissa tells herself that she would mend her dress. Her maids had too much to do. She would take her silks, her scissors, her thimble, of course, down into the drawing room. This labor draws Clarissa out of the confinement of her bedroom and down into a more public space. It is notable that with both tasks Clarissa engages in, mending a dress and buying flowers, she insists upon her activity being an effort to help her servants. Even when Clarissa's maid, Lucy, cheerfully offers to mend the dress, Clarissa insists that Lucy has enough on her hands already, quite enough of her own to do without that. She tells herself, at any rate, that she undertakes these tasks because her servants are too busy. She labors in their stead. The insistence that she is doing the work on behalf of the servants also feels like a way of affirming the virtue of her actions to herself. She is the lady of the house and would not ordinarily be required to engage in these tasks, so she feels like her labor in this circumstance is an act of generosity. This sense of her inserting herself into the cooperative action that her servants are working towards aligns with Morris's views that labor is a self-affirming thing when it is done as a cooperative, harmonious, purposeful act. The effect that manual labor has on Clarissa is transformative. Settling down in her drawing room to sew her dress, quiet descended on her, calm, content, as her needle, drawing the silk smoothly to its gentle paws, collected the green folds together and attached them very lightly to the belt. The focus on the task, the action of doing work that she feels is valuable, calms Clarissa and brings comfort and quiet to the room in her mind. It is important to read this sewing scene in the context of what has come almost immediately before, the mirror scene, in which Clarissa sits in her bedroom staring at the mirror, her identity crumbling in solitude. Cornelia Burrian refers to this mirror scene as evidence that Clarissa appears as a coherent self only in front of others. When alone, she feels shattered into irreconcilable fragments, a deep self-alienation caused by a traumatic shattering of her identity. Clarissa shapes her identity in relation to others, what others think of her and how they perceive her, but she struggles to be a self without those external perceptions. Alone, she shatters. How remarkable, then, that following this moment of being alone in her room with a broken identity, Clarissa finds a moment of solitude in which she settles. But Clarissa's labor is not a solitary thing. She's doing it as a part of the collective effort of the household to put together a party. So perhaps she feels like her identity, once again, is held up in relation to other people because she's contributing to the larger project of laboring. The quiet and contentment that sewing brings Clarissa recalls an earlier moment when she feels irked by some force that has affected her since she had influenza. It rasped her, though, to have stirring about in her this brutal monster, to hear twigs cracking and feel hooves planted down in the depths of that leaf-encumbered forest, the soul. Never to be content quite, or quite secure, for at any moment the brute would be stirring. Clarissa finds that her soul is polluted with noise. Contentment and security is impossible to find, but as she sits, mending her dress, doing her part in the cooperative production of her party, all these concerns seem to lift. There is quiet and contentment, and a sense of security. The act of sewing, and in extension the act of laboring, counteracts the mysterious, troubling monster within Clarissa. In an examination of the dress-mending scene, Elizabeth Gallagher von Klemperer writes that sewing with silk clearly gives Clarissa sensuous pleasure coupled with imaginative freedom. She points out the passage's beauty and the sense of enjoyment that Clarissa gets from the act of sewing silk. Clarissa's experience of working echoes Morris's proposition that labor should involve or produce pleasure. Klemperer also notes the way the passage compiles many of the thematic elements of the novel. Clarissa connects the torn material with her single thread in the same way that the novel threads together consciousnesses, timelines, color schemes, and dualities of life and death. But Klemperer mentions nothing about the effect that sewing has on Clarissa herself, noting instead that in Woolf's body of work, sewing belongs to women and can be understood as a metaphor for connecting within the mind. This metaphorical use of sewing to indicate the interior process of binding together bits of memories, feelings, and thoughts is certainly displayed in Mrs. Dalloway, especially in the wake of pondering her fragmented self. The gathering of the fabric back to its rightful place mirrors Clarissa gathering herself back together. As she sews, Clarissa connects the scattered shards of her mind, becoming content and calm, and through the act of reassembling the dress, she reassembles herself. The physical act of laboring, creating, and working towards a purposeful end has a positive effect on her mental state. The labor of sewing and creating affects Rezia and Septimus as well as Clarissa. In a scene closer to the end of the novel, Rezia works on designing and producing a hat for Mrs. Peters, while Septimus observes her. He notes that Rezia is perfectly natural sewing. This physical labor for Rezia, unlike Clarissa, is a way to earn a living, is an incredibly natural thing and a part of Rezia's identity. She is comfortable in herself and the value she brings to the world through her artistic production. In a rare moment, Septimus seems to regain some semblance of a normal relationship with his wife as he starts helping Rezia. He arranges flowers to create the design for the hat, and Rezia contemplates his talent for it. He had a wonderful eye, and he was often right. Sometimes absurd, of course, but sometimes wonderfully right. With Septimus's work on the hat complete, the story swings to his perspective, and he decides that the hat was wonderful. Never had he ever done anything which had made him feel so proud. It was so real, it was so substantial, Mrs. Peters' hat. Septimus had been disengaged from the world, from tasks, and from work for so long, but as he steps back into the realm of labor, physically manipulating material and witnessing and assisting in the creation of a garment, he is flooded with pride. Working alongside someone to create something that will be useful gives Septimus that fulfillment and sense of honor that Morris believes is so valuable. The aftermath of this act of creating is that Septimus very unusually has a quiet mind. He was very tired, he was very happy, he would sleep, he says to himself. Septimus, who has been struggling desperately with his inability to feel, feels something. He feels happy, he feels tired. This scene recalls the previously examined experience that Clarissa has as she mends her dress, where the work makes her quiet, calm, and content. Septimus, through the act of arranging flowers, drawing together a beautiful collection of colors, seems to be simultaneously arranging the parts of himself that keep getting mixed up, out of order, jumbled, and confused. He fashions the hat and refashions himself, and in the aftermath of that labor, the effect of his wartime trauma is at least temporarily mitigated. Through creative labor, Septimus reconnects with his wife in a genuine interaction, and by joining the cooperative of laboring people, he takes a step towards reintegrating himself with the world and the self that he has been alienated from. In the minds of both Rezia and himself, he is better somehow. The depth of Septimus's trauma and alienation cannot be solved by simply working to make one hat, and his mind quickly returns to its troubled state. But no matter how brief the moment was, through the act of laboring, he finds some respite. In Rezia's eyes, when Septimus helps her with the hat, he had become himself then. He had laughed then. Though Rezia is out of touch with her husband and unable to understand how he feels, as Septimus feels happy and sleepy, Rezia recognizes him returning to a version of himself she once knew. Not the self that was completely untouched by the war, but the self that was still good at hiding it. So far, I've only looked at examples of physical domestic tasks having a positive effect upon characters, but the book also solidifies the importance of labor through the position it takes on the absence of labor. The threat and repercussions of the rest cure loom large in Woolf's novel. The perpetrator and champion of the rest cure, Sir William Bradshaw, is painted in an unsavory light and disliked by Clarissa, who describes him as obscurely evil, a man who makes life intolerable, which is the first indication that the novel wants the readers to be at odds with the labor-denying treatment. For Septimus, and presumably for Clarissa too, the possibility of endless nothingness, of being forced to be still and quiet and removed from any and all sense of purpose, is a cruel and scary fate. According to Sir William Bradshaw, though, Septimus's ability to return to health is merely a question of rest, a long rest in bed. There is, of course, nothing further from labor than rest, and as we have already seen, what actually seems to draw Septimus and Clarissa closer to a grounded, content, happy state of being was occupation that brought them pleasure and made them feel connected to the larger body of working people. Rest, 4 times over, as Bradshaw would have it, is not what Woolf advocates for. Indeed, Septimus's impulse is that death is a better option than confinement and months spent doing nothing. It bears mentioning that for Septimus, death is not just an escape from his troubles, it's not just a romantic end to suffering, but it's also a direct escape from the rest cure. In his moment of groundedness, his moment of being happy, proud, and tired, and his moment of feeling, Septimus chooses death. Despite considering suicide for the majority of the novel, he is finally spurred on to do it by the imposing presence of a doctor and the impending doom of rest. Although Mrs. Dalloway largely deals with upper-class characters, barely dipping a toe into growing issues around labor and class relations, it still displays the deep ties between labor and selfhood that were being debated in Britain as the century turned. The novel displays the characters who feel most separated from themselves, regaining some sense of selfhood and contentment when they engage in acts of domestic labor. Not only that, but Woolf takes a clear stance against the idea of forced rest, with Septimus fearing the inhumane fate of the rest cure so intensely that he kills himself. The novel suggests engagement in some sort of physical task, some sort of labor, as a way to begin the reintegration of a fragmented self into the world, and through that integration into the world, be able to rebuild or mend the sense of self that has been broken. Whether or not acts of labor are supposed to be viewed as painkillers that temporarily remedy deeper trauma, or as a serious proposal for how fragmented, traumatized, or alienated people might regain a sense of self, is a discussion for another time and someone else's brain, but there are certainly aspects of Woolf's story that demonstrate the surface-level positive effects that labor has on injured psyches. Thank you.
Does this pick me up? Am I in it? No? Yeah? What about now? Yeah. Okay. My essay is called Poetic, Potentiality, Crisis of Connection in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. The first quarter of the 20th century was a time of unprecedented turmoil and transition. Those first years saw the tragedy of the Great War, while the following influenza outbreak of 1918 claimed millions of lives. The majority of European and American populations were crammed in dense urban squalor. Empires fell. The world, it seemed, was physically and ideologically in ruins. Established beliefs and institutions such as the domestic sphere, Western religion, myth, and tradition had collapsed, no longer providing the underlying channels of meaning they once had. Eliot's 1922 epic poem, The Wasteland, following the extraordinary destruction and transition of the new millennium, epitomizes this collapse of the foundation of meaning in the early 20th century. Against this context, the poem presents a discordant world capable of reunification, a new ontology forced as a synthesis of what is fractured, old and new, east and west, male and female. Critically, Eliot uses poetry to navigate the discordant realities of gender relations, myth, and the Western tradition to ultimately appraise the power of poetry to create a new understanding for a new world. The creation of an aesthetic product and process does not merely replicate the experience of society, but reinvents its loss into a new meaning, which is the principal creative impulse of The Wasteland. Gender disharmony is a consistent thematic throughout The Wasteland. The second section, A Game of Chess, imagines the fractured relationship between men and women. The speaker consoles a woman he is close to. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. The speaker is unable to give a meaningful reply. When urged to think and accused of doing nothing, he replies, I think we are in a rat's alley where the dead men lost their bones. And I remember those are the pearls that were his eyes. The pearl eyes here are evocative of the drowned Phoenician sailor in Burial of the Dead. The memory of death is presented as a symptom of the speaker's inability to communicate. The speaker's memory of war, with drowned faces and bodies robbed of limbs, is the source of the inability to be understood by one another. This fracturing of the domestic sphere is further established later in the same passage. The locale shifted to a pub in London, where two women gossip about the relationship between Lil and her recently demobilized husband, Albert. Instead of celebrating reuniting following the war, there is anxiety. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique, and her only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. She's had 5 already and nearly died of young George. There is no harmony between the couple, only fear of the man's sexual appetite and the abandonment of his wife, if she cannot maintain the beauty and sexual standards imposed upon her. The hostility of the domestic sphere reaches such a wide extent that the product of their procreation is terminated. This space, it seems, is not conducive to life, and the effects ravage her body. Because of interpersonal fissures created by the war, the domestic sphere is no longer capable of achieving what was once held both true and expected, the creation of life. As Astrid Enslin writes, the barren landscape serves as an analogy of ruined, sterilized femininity. Its desolation has been caused by male figures, which implies that female regeneration is contingent on the death of the male. However, mutual interdependence between the two sexes cannot be overcome in The Wasteland. It has been remarked by some critics that The Wasteland epitomizes male post-war disillusionment with a new woman, who threatened to take over men's traditional role of patriarchy in society and the literary world. The overall tone presents the relationship between men and women as the key problem of modernity. Men and women's ability to be mutually known and understood is presented as a complete impossibility in the world of the Wasteland. In diagnosing the discordance in the domestic sphere in the modern age, the figure of Tiresias offers an opportunity to mend what is broken. In the Fire Sermon, against the backdrop of a sexually violent exchange between a clerk and a typist, notably gendered and modern roles, the hermaphroditic mythical prophet Tiresias witnesses the rape. Neither the male clerk nor the female typist is aware of the significance of their actions. He bestows a final patronizing kiss, and she is unaware of her departed lover. Outside of the sexual distance provoked, there is an inability to perceive the magnitude of what has happened. Tiresias' ability to perceive and foretell the scene places him in a position of understanding that the scene's actors do not hold. As he rests upon the boundary between male and female, Tiresias is granted a level of agency that the other characters are not given, the ability to perceive both genders and distinguish the symbolic significance of gender dynamics. He is the only one who knows the scene, knows its outcomes, and sees the fractured nature of the modern domestic space. In imbuing Tiresias with the esoteric knowledge, the wasteland moves from the diagnostic to the prognostic. Through poetry, Eliot establishes this discordance and then unifies this opposition through Tiresias. Only through breaking down the boundaries of gender and rebuilding them into something new, an in-between state, can the relation between men and women be understood and repaired into a state of knowing. In the wasteland, myth and tradition are also fractured. The poem is inundated with allusions to Greco-Roman myth, Arthurian legend, and English folklore, as well as contemporary song. There is no single source or key. The poem is a montage. On the one hand, it replicates the chatter of ideas in the modern urban world, the new accessibility of thinking for what was once unable to access previously restrictive modes of education and text. However, on the other hand, little is sacred in the wasteland. To the speaker, it seems not all traditions and myths are created equal, and in the busy market of thinking, a unifying aspect of society has been lost. As Linda Pratt puts it, the modern writer's need for myth is acute in a society which lacks any cohesive belief or coherent design of its own. Eliot's poem bears witness to the defeat of the sacred by the profane. Pratt's essay highlights the reconstruction of myth in the wasteland as a deliberate response to the fractured nature of society in the early 20th century. In the final section of the poem, entitled What the Thunder Said, the speaker moves through several of these myths and traditions. In one stanza, the speaker embodies the Arthurian figure of the fisherkin from Chrétien de Troyes' Percival, the story of the Grail, saying, "I sat upon the shore fishing, before singing a traditional English children's song, London Bridge is falling down." These decidedly Western aspects of the poem are juxtaposed completely against the Eastern portions, the use of Sanskrit and the early Hindu sacred chant of Datta Deodaram Deyamata. This fractured tapestry of historical myth and tradition from around the globe is not placed into a position of sacrality, but rather all part of the empty desert death of the wasteland. Here there is no water, but only rock. Eliot, however, juxtaposes this meaninglessness against the aesthetic use of his allusions, which reinforces the effect of the modern urban world. It demonstrates the concrete potentiality of poetry to diagnose and create change. The fracturing of tradition as a result of the modern world is recentered by the poem, where traditional sources of myth cannot make sense of a technological, pandemic-ridden and war-torn world. The wasteland constructs a new sense and a new mythos that is constructed from the ruins of the myth and traditions no longer seen as capable of providing meaning in a modern world. While compositionally different from the source, the function of the myth is the same, as Pratt attests. Eliot's use of the Grail material is a telling contrast, for despite its less traditional version, he interprets the material in a wholly traditional way. In Eliot's Wasteland, the Grail offers spiritual salvation and an escape from a meaningless worldly existence, the conventional meaning of the myth. Eliot instead utilizes the loss of a distinctive system of tradition in the modern world to create a new impersonal myth and tradition that is a direct response to the contemporary age and universally understood. The old and new, East and West, are synthesized, reappropriated, and recentered into the poem as aspects of an artistic piece. Fragmented aspects of various myths and traditions are unified into a single work that is a direct response to the contemporary age. Eliot himself, in the use of poetry and the use of criticism, retaliates against the understanding of the wasteland as a poem severed from belief. I am no better qualified to say no than is any other reader. The statement might mean that the wasteland was the first of poetry to do what all poetry of the past would have been better for doing. It might also mean that the present situation is radically different from any in which poetry has been produced in the past, namely, that now there is nothing in which to believe, that belief itself is dead, and that therefore my poem is the first to respond properly to the modern situation and not call upon make-believe. Thus, the wasteland is not severed from belief, but is rather a poem that does what all poems, in Eliot's eyes, do, respond to their environment. To end at separation is an injustice to the aesthetic mission of his poetry. While in this essay he avoids a steadfast definition of poetry and its meaning, Eliot does disclose that the chief meaning of a poem, in the ordinary sense, may be to satisfy one habit of the reader, to keep his mind diverted and quiet, while the poem does its work upon him, much as the imaginary burger is always provided a nice bit of meat for the house dog. This is a normal situation that I approve. Subconscious connection, to use the psychologist's terminology, is the primary vehicle of meaning-making in Eliot's poetry, and thus holds the key to the understanding connection in the wasteland. Eliot replicates the discordance and the distance of the Western world, and through poetry and its cultivation of subconscious meaning, integrates the reader, the poem, and the disparate sources of anxiety and separation in society back into one centered upon the poem. The poem is not divorced from belief, but rather replicates its surroundings. It brings the reader, through their distance, back to a place in which connection and belief can be felt and seen. If we understand the wasteland to be responding to the loss of historical axioms of Western Europe and North America, then the loss of connection is a theme that threads throughout the poem, and the rupture between gender relations, traditional meaning and myth, and the distance from a definitive God. The prevailing link between these themes is the loss of connection from the individual to the broader social unifiers. In the Fire Sermon, the speaker embodies a worker on the banks of the Thames. On Margate sands I can connect with nothing, the broken fingernails of dirty hands, my humble people who expect nothing. Connection is absent in the milieu of the wasteland. Eliot attributes to the post-war modern world an absence of meaning and connection. The fractured quality of the poem as a whole supports this. The shift between perspectives with little crossover emphasizes not unity but isolation. Only aesthetic work can bridge the gap between individuals in this world. The loss of connection is expressed by Elizabeth Uchter as a direct result of the influenza pandemic upon Eliot. In the chapter on the wasteland in her book Viral Modernism, Uchter expands upon existing thought that the wasteland captured the zeitgeist of the post-war consciousness, and argues that Eliot did the same thing for the post-pandemic consciousness, channeling a set of experiences and fragments that were haunting the culture, but were so difficult to represent. Uchter demonstrates the relationship the wasteland has to the physical and psychological impact of the Spanish flu from 1918 to 1920. To expand on this notion, I argue that the miasmic quality of the plague is replicated ideologically as well. Individuals are quarantined not only from one another, but from the traditional and historical sources of belief and meaning. Uchter reads Eliot's epigraph of the poem as a form of an interlocutor of the post-pandemic consciousness. Sybil is encapsulated in a living death, stuck in a jar like a medical specimen, technically alive but blocked from any meaningful existence. She is a fitting figure for this cultural moment, forced to go on living despite being overwhelmed by physical and emotional suffering. Beyond the physical suffering, I offer that the figure of Sybil trapped in a jar is the figure of mankind in the post-war and the post-pandemic world. While able to see, connection to anyone and anything is made impossible to her individualized prison. Sybil's hermetically sealed nature is whole. There is no escape and no end. The death of meaning in the wasteland is completely connected to established modes of meaning-making that haunt the poem. In this regard, the poem again diagnoses the contemporary age and expresses this need for connection to myth, tradition, and gender differences in a divided world's alignment with the death of the wasteland. However, the death and destruction of traditional modes of belief does not occur without aim. What were once held to be fundamental fountains of knowledge and meaning to an individual's and society's life are evoked as lost to war, the ravages of the plague, and the collapse of empire and religion. Now, to understand the modern world, to know one another, and to find meaning in life is presented by Eliot as a duty to the subconsciousness. Through art, principally poetry, we're able to pick through the mosaic of ruined past truths to grasp at those things that make life worth living, meat for the house dog. The wasteland recenters the reader. The poem fuses ancient and modern, east and west, and male and female into a single body that is impersonal and universal. Gender relations and traditional modes of authority in tradition, myth, and religion have been fragmented and dispersed. What is fractured to the speaker is made whole again through poetry. The wasteland guides the hand of society to remake and reshape our understandings of these things, especially in a time that has no longer computes with the experience of our reality. The wasteland is a poem of potentiality. Through aesthetic experience that are informed by context, Eliot deploys an art that can reshape the world individually and systemically into one of connection, meaning, and virtue built from the ruins of what once was.
Hey, I'm Darcy Deegan, and I'm reading my paper, Navigating the Invisible, The Math of Shame and Development in Milkman. The woman's journey into adulthood is, as Susan Freeman remarks, not a single path to a clear destination, but the endless negotiation of crossroads. These endless crossroads and their obstacles exist in the exterior world and the public spheres because development is highly reliant on interactions with others. Within this social domain lies the pervasive presence of shame, not merely as a passive bystander, but as a fundamental tool to shape development. Sylvan Tompkins observes in his observation as shame as an affect that the collective experience of shame serves to reinforce social bonds, contributing to the cohesion of communities. Not only is shame a powerful tool for the community, but researchers have deduced that shame most defines a space wherein a sense of self will develop. Thus, shame emerges as a catalyst for individual growth and as a linchpin in the fabric of society. The process of development unfolds within the public sphere, traditionally structured to fit the patriarchy. Thus, women navigate a landscape that does not inherently accommodate their needs and arrive at these crossroads. Despite shame's functional role in societal dynamics, it prevents challenges to the developmental process, fraught with invisible challenges, proving difficult to navigate. Anna Burns' Milkman underscores the difficulty of navigating society as a budding female adolescent through middle sister struggle as she grapples with identity formation in an always watching society that uses shame as a tool for unity. Middle sister retreats inside herself as an attempt to hide from the invisible hands that probe her at every turn. But consequently, by avoiding her community and the necessary society that one needs to engage with to reach adulthood, to develop, she avoids this shame. Shame plays a pivotal role in shaping societal dynamics within Milkman. During the Troubles, a period marked by intense social and political unrest, Middle Sister articulates a very nuanced understanding of shame, confessing, quote, "I didn't know shame. I mean as a word, because as a word, it hadn't entered the communal vocabulary. Certainly I knew the feeling of shame, and I knew everybody around me knew that feeling as well. Another thing is that it was often a public feeling." In this revelation, Middle Sister underscores two crucial aspects of shame: its intangible nature, lacking a concrete name, and its intricate connection to the public sphere. Throughout Milkman, the consequences of shame and how it impacts developing youth in a hair-trigger society shows the fraught, mapless path of women's development. Belonging to a community entails embracing shame as an acknowledgement of the established boundaries delineating acceptable and unacceptable behavior. This becomes particularly significant for Middle Sister, who exists within a society characterized by hypervigilance, where many rules linger unspoken. In this environment, these unspoken rules serve not only to bind the community together, but to also safeguard its members. And to break the rules is to be shamed. However, Middle Sister grapples with accepting shame from her community. Whether it pertains to her reading and walking habit, the rumors about her and Milkman, or even the act of her carrying around cat heads. Rejecting shame is a failure to show regard for the ones doing the shaming. And this disregard only serves to distance herself further from being accepted. Middle Sister steadfastly refrains from offering any reaction towards the community, leading her community to perceive her as someone who is now beyond the pale. The community's negative reaction to Middle Sister's lack of expression partly stems from the prominent role that the face plays in conveying shame. Shame is expressed through the blushing of cheeks, the lowering of eyes, and the hanging of the head. However, this expression of shame, quote, may also be that of reading maps, magazines, novels, the force field creating power of this attitude by a certain pernicious understanding of reading as an escape from what? the real world, ostensibly the responsibility of acting, performing in that world, end quote. Consequently, reading has become a way of looking away, avoiding direct eye contact, deflect any potential shame. Preemptively. Even before her involvement with Milkman, Middle Sister relies on this protective barrier that reading provides to shield herself from the prying eyes of her community and the responsibilities of performing her role in her community. The refusal to accept shame carries another deep consequences beyond facing rejection from that community, and therefore stunting development. Rejecting shame is to reject interest altogether. Tompkins' research, quote, places shame, in fact, at one end of the affect polarity of shame interest, suggesting that the pulsations of Carthrex around shame, of all things, are what enable or disable so basic a function as the ability to be interested in the world. This repercussion becomes evident when Middle Sister does not turn inward, but becomes silent, frozen, and numb. In an attempt to avoid shame, Middle Sister remains a blank demeanor when questioned by her community members. But soon, this has an unintended and negative impact. Middle Sister expresses. At first, an emotional numbness set in. Thus, my feelings stopped expressing. Then, they stopped existing. And now, this numbness from nowhere had come so far in its development that along with others in the area of finding me inaccessible, I too came to find me inaccessible. My inner world, it seemed, had gone away. Tompkins' theories manifested in Middle Sister, who loses all interest in the world, discontinuing activities such as attending French class, running with her third brother-in-law, seeing her maybe boyfriend, and even sleeping. By shutting off shame, she inadvertently shuts off interest. Her inner world and her sense of self disappear, never mind developing into a woman. Middle Sister loses grasp on her identity during this misstep into her social world. Middle Sister admits that this numbness is something that spirals out of her control, stating, I'd assumed that how my face looked, how I was making it look, how I presented it outwardly, was down to me, under the control of me, that I am deep in the council chamber. Thought, too, I had chosen a subordinate to assist me, not some rebel to turn the tables and override me. Since shame and interest are such opposites, and yet so instinctively tied together, by keeping a blank face free of blushing or aversion of the eyes, Middle Sister discards both shame and interest. Her numbness spreads beyond the face into the clutches of the very depths of her identity, affecting her formation of self and jeopardizing her development. By shunning shame, Middle Sister is effectively isolating herself from her community, distancing herself from the very environment in which development thrives. The repercussion of this withdrawal manifests in dangerous behaviors and consequential effects. She expresses, given shame was such a complex, involved, very advanced feeling, most people here did all kinds of premonitions in order not to have it. Killing people, doing verbal damage to people, doing mental damage to people, and not in the least, and not infrequently, doing those things to oneself. An essential aspect that cannot be overlooked is the self-inflicted harm incurred to evade accepting shame. Middle Sister is aware that her avoidance of shame and display of a blank face have led to harmful consequences. I realized my strategy were incidental against my gossipy neighbors, and more in the main against myself. I was attacking myself, and it was my face. This insightful introspective underscores the damaging repercussions of avoiding shame. Fully realizing it after the fact, Middle Sister speaks about how this problem is larger than just herself, but her whole community is troubled by shame. Part of the difficulty of joining the social world is inheriting the problems of that world. And in this case, the dangerous methods of handling shame. In a community so full of strife, it can be difficult to want to be a part of it. As Middle Sister states, I know that by reading while I walked, I was losing in touch a crucial sense with the communal up-to-dateness that is, indeed, risky. Despite being aware that by pulling away from the community could be dangerous, she still chooses to close herself off. Middle Sister finds herself in a challenging situation where joining the world comes with drawbacks, such as adopting the behavior and habits of those within it. Nevertheless, being rejected from the community is perilous due to the dangerous landscapes of the Troubles, and to the way rejection removes one from the key location of development. Middle sister retreats from her community because she grapples with invisible hands and forces constantly reaching out to her. Her evasion of shame is connected to her consistent efforts to avoid these imperceptible touches, whether from the pervasive scrutiny via shame from the community, or from the intrusive stalking by Milkman. Middle sister describes her world as a hair-trigger society where the ground rules were, if no physical violent touch was being laid upon you, and no outright verbal insults were being leveled at you, and no taunting looks in the vicinity either, then nothing was happening. So how could you be under attack from something that wasn't there? Her world only sees the tangible, such as bruises, and the invisible attacks go unignored and overlooked. The consequences of this quiet violence is that middle sister doubts that there is anything to report, anything to tell about the harassment she's experiencing, and is forced to suffer alone. The absence of language to convey her experiences in her environment has her questioning, was he actually doing anything? Was anything happening? If I didn't know, how could I explain to and convince anybody else? If only physical touch counts as violence, then, quote, stalking without touch, tracking without touch, hemming in, taking over, controlling a person with no flesh on flesh, no bone on bone, ensuing, could not then be happening. If something is not happening, and by community standards the definition isn't happening, how could middle sister reach out to anybody in her community for help? Shame and violence by Milkman are both invisible, without the proper language to define them, leaving middle sister with no way to navigate these obstacles. Nor is the community innocent in perpetrating this touchless form of abuse. Middle sister expresses, I needed my silence, my unaccommodation, to shield me from the pawing and molestation by these questions. Middle sister's intentional choice of words is significant, likening the community's intrusive questioning to the act of molestation to underscore the non-consensual and harassing nature of their curiosity. Becoming blank and unreadable is an attempt to prevent anyone from spying on her and to keep a distance from this oppressive society. Her efforts to shield herself from these unreportable touches, to be unaccommodating, to remain a proper border, and to be frozen from the world around her are in part an attempt to protect herself from the difficulties of a social world that fails to validate the violence she experiences. While middle sister's environment relies on shame to strengthen the community and to maintain unity, the excessive shame prevalent in her environment may have diminished her desire to be an active part of the community. Wormer describes this effect as depersonalization, which is a state of passivity where feelings become repressed, succinctly describing the way middle sister can no longer feel anything, apparent when she asks herself, where's our reaction? We were having a privately expressed reaction, but now we're not having it. Where is it? Important to note that during this line of questioning, middle sister uses a plural to speak to herself, as if her body and her mind are separate, or even as herself as she know it is no longer present, creating a dual personhood of who she is now and who she was before. Middle sister struggles, supported by neither language available at the time, nor are they recognized by the community as violence. They are invisible. Without guidance, without the proper language to use, these invisible forces of shame, harassment, judgment make the social world exceedingly difficult to navigate. Only through a retrospective lens can middle sister successfully chart the obstacles and twisted terrain of her youth, comprehending in hindsight the hurdles on her path on becoming a woman. With distance, middle sister can recognize that all this time she'd been an active player, a contributing element, a major component in the downfall of herself. This kind of acknowledgement comes from having space from these troubled times. Narrating the story from many years later allows middle sister to view and analyze that period of her life now that her environment is seemingly no longer as troubled or all-consuming as it once was. Middle sister also confirms that she had no sense of entitlement in herself, which is an aspect of shame because shame requires the recognition that I am, in some important sense, as I am to be seen. Meaning that who someone is depends largely on how one is seen. If middle sister lacks the entitlement to be seen and judged by her community, choosing instead to present nothing for them to observe, she inevitably becomes what she has projected, nothing. Moreover, there are numerous instances where Middle Sister underscores just how lost she was while navigating her social world. Middle Sister reflects on the violence of her violation of her boundaries, stating, "At 18, I had no proper understanding of the ways that constituted encroachment." She also acknowledges her inadequacy in handling the situations involving Milkman, and the ensuing gossip about him, expressing, "It turned out to be a rapid learning on the job. I had not plotted for this. There had been no time to plot for this. And anyways, my mind didn't work the best in plots, in blueprints, join the dots, prognations, arrangements." These moments emphasize how ill-prepared Middle Sister was for this tumultuous world. Through a long lens, the novel reveals a lack of guidance provided to help young women navigate through these challenging times. There was no one to explain harassment, and even those who wanted to help Middle Sister were perceived as giving off powerful yet invisible indicators and having an off-kilter atmosphere in which they chose to surround themselves in. During the unfolding of these events, Middle Sister is unable to grasp the broader perspective of her world, confined as she is to her limited understanding, which is hindered by the absence of guidance. The retrospective and distant narration not only offers insights into the reasons beyond her actions, but also explains how her social world operates. Navigating shame is to navigate something invisible. Middle Sister creates a map in which she traces the path of her troubled journey into adulthood and sketches out the scope and effect of shame on her development. Through the retrospective lens of her adolescence, Middle Sister can see her social world, her community, as one defined by shame and hypervigilance. Since shame and development are so tightly linked, Middle Sister missteps by rejecting shame through her body cues of reading and walking. With her eyes down, this behavior, interpreted as a lack of awareness, not only contravenes social norm, but also causes harm to herself. However, to escape shame also means escaping interest in the world. This escape, coupled with presenting a blank face to her community, results in a numbness that begins to take over her identity. In her world of invisible touches, of shame, of stalkers, of invasive community pressing in on all sides where only physical violence is recognized, the rejection of the social sphere seems logical. But it comes at the cost of her identity and her development. Despite this, through her struggles, Middle Sister illustrates her journey through shame and her complex social world, making the invisible visible. As such, Milkman outlines a path into womanhood that for girls is seldom provided, offering both Middle Sister and the reader a view beyond the many crossroads on the way to becoming a woman. Thank you.
Those are great. Thank you all. So I think we're ready to open up a brief Q&A. I'll also leave it to Michelle to kind of help moderate the discussion, but we welcome, of course, any questions from the audience or any insights that you'd like to share.
Is there a microphone for folks in the audience, or? Do you want to go ahead?
Thank you. I have a question for Hannah about to invite you to talk more about the provocative recasting of, I guess, like consumption therapy as labor. In the case of Clarissa going out to get the flowers and to do these tasks in Bond Street. So I thought, would you want to talk maybe a little more about shifting from Clarissa Dalloway is obviously very, an aristocratic woman who doesn't even have to buy her own flowers, of course. So it kind of transforms it into labor by doing it herself, and then embarks on what to us looks like shopping therapy. But what you're seeing is actually a very constructive form of labor engagement. So if you're interested in taking that up.
Right. It's funny, Professor Yeager said that these conferences are often ways to, start with your new ideas and put them out in the world. And I wrote this like a year ago and haven't thought about it since. I guess like I start with the thing about the flowers because it's like such a good entry point to the novel, and it's like that first insistence that like we're gonna try and make Clarissa seem like she's trying to do something valuable here. But I was sort of more interested in like in the sewing and that domestic labor standpoint, I guess. But I do think like she so often seems to be so insistent that what she's doing is valuable to other people and not just herself. And I think like I don't know if shopping therapy is really where I was going with that, but I do think that like that insistence, like I'm doing this because no one else can, and it's like necessary to keep my kind of lifestyle going and to entertain these guests, is like her way of feeling like she's part of something after being kind of like separated for so long. And she's always concerned with like people who are more involved than her, and I think she's just like desperate to have some sense of involvement. You know, later on she's like I'm fascinated by the hostess character and how she's like the host of the party and the host of the novel and so on and so forth. But like this seems like not so much hosting and more like participating in like the underlings. That's not the right word, but you know, like she's trying to be part of like the base layer instead of like this person on top. Please don't ask me any more questions.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for this session. It's funny, like you know, one of the questions that I find myself thinking about these papers and what brought them all together is, I guess, a kind of ambivalence about the desire for community. Seems to be something that that all of you, like Darcy, you know, your paper, you know, a really wonderful analysis of the double valences of shame, which I'm going to go into my medieval studies thing for a second and say that performance of shame and looking for the signs of it is a big part of medieval confession manuals. Like when the sacrament of confession really gets going, there's these very detailed descriptions of, you know, what you're supposed to look for to tell if they're really sorry or not, and so what the act of contrition is, and which is actually very important because then those get taken up in canon law and brought into then criminal procedures where you know, the performance of shame, you know, is deeply bound up in our juridical context, which is so an ambivalence about so in the paper I heard this ambivalence about community around the topic of, you know, crime and punishment and you know, these behaviors that can't be criminalized because they're invisible, and you, Ben, with your talking about the Fisher King and the whole like Jesse Weston and James Frazier, you know, the I suppose like the, you know, when T.S. Eliot makes that connection between East and West, he's thinking about that in terms of like a sort of Indo-European like primal connection between all of these people and you know, a sort of a past about which I think he is ultimately somewhat ambivalent. And so, you know, so what does that, what you know, you talk about like this new vision of like what a new myth or new community might look like, but you know, but again, like in all of the papers, you know, what does that ideal relationship of community look like? Like with Clarissa, you know, she seemed, not to ask you a question, but she, I mean, it strikes me as a moment of great psychological realism for her to say that she can't do something that she wants to do for herself and say that that's why she wants to do it, that it has to be on behalf of others, that it's this sort of sense of, she can't have a sense of self except through others, but and actually to go all the way back to Michelle, you know, community being something that we work towards, we value, we strive to build, and you know, encourage the youth to work towards, but also being something which can be in attention with our sense of selves. You know, this problem of establishing what they call boundaries around the service that one does to others. You know, the extent to which being an individual and having a sense of self is a good, psychologically productive thing. Anyway, it's just like that was the theme, I suppose. That so I'm just going to stop rambling there and just kick it to you guys. And Darcy, beginning with you, what are your sort of thoughts, I suppose, in Milkman about the ambivalences about the value of community?
I think it's not that there's an ambivalence about community, because they stress that community is so important to be a part of it. But I think it's the fact that there's no room for anyone that's beyond the pale. And I think that's the big problem, is that these people that are now labored beyond the pale get ignored, neglected, and rejected by community, and therefore they're now at risk. And there's got to be room somewhere to either expand the definition of who can be accepted by community, or more space to include community, and just more guidance for people to, be in this community. So I hope that kind of answers your question a little bit. Cool.
You asked about like what if all of these are things are broken in this like primordial Indo-European connection. I see Eliot a lot like Yeats as a kind of mournful modernist that I think, especially with like taking into consideration like his conversion to Anglicanism, I think that when he sees all of these things breaking down, he's quite nervous about the future of like society. I think maybe his definition of community is maybe more restrictive than one we'd have today. But I kind of think of the wasteland as almost like kintsugi, like the Japanese pot repair with the gold. I think that he's really trying to salvage as much as possible from the past. If people don't see the value in these things, I think he's trying to appropriate new means to see the value that's been hidden rather than completely destroyed. So I think community for Eliot and the wasteland is, I think, I'm not sure if ambivalent truly captures it. I think it's been shattered, and I think he's trying to rebuild the figure what once was, and not necessarily create something entirely new, like the pound kind of impulse.
Was about Mrs. Dalloway, and what did you ask something, or was it just the ambivalence of community? Is that where we're going? I think maybe one thing that's interesting is like there's this sense that none of the communities that people are part of really are like helpful. Like Mrs. Dalloway is in a community, but she doesn't feel like she is. Like she's such an isolated person, and she doesn't have any friends. And I wonder if sort of the attempts she makes to like feel like she's part of this like effort of laboring and everything is like an attempt to reach out to a different community and find something there. And I think that's like similar to Milkman. It's like sometimes the community does not fit, right? And it's like, how do you like be self in a community that you don't belong to? And I think that's what we see maybe with Clarissa and I guess with Septimus too, although he's a bit of a different story. But like all over the place, it's like this ambivalence between, like maybe there's like a better community for you, but it's never like represented in the texts, especially with Milkman. I'm so excited. We were in the same class when we read this book, so I was like very excited to hear this paper because it was the final one that we never discussed. I'm done.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming to our first panel, and it's been a wonderful panel. Thank you everyone for speaking, and thank you, Michelle. And thank you. We have some pastries and coffee over there behind the projecting screen if anyone would like. And we'll have another panel starting at 1 p.m. that will be focusing on intersections with history. So if anyone's interested in that, feel free to stick around, feel free to have some pastries and coffee, and thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. Those of you on Zoom, we're going to keep the Zoom open. We're going to leave the live stream running, too. We're just going to pause it. And I'll see you back at 1 o'clock. Thanks.